One of the most controversial aspects of the KarmeloAnthony case centers on the hundreds of thousands of dollars raised on his behalf and the questions that have surfaced since his conviction. Over the course of the case, Anthony's family raised more than $630,000 through an official crowdfunding campaign hosted on GiveSendGo, with the total reportedly reaching approximately $633,688. The fundraiser was launched shortly after the April 2025 track meet stabbing and was described as a way to help cover legal expenses, security needs, relocation costs, and other family living expenses while the case was pending. According to GiveSendGo, funds were distributed to the family throughout the year as those expenses arose. Following Anthony's conviction and sentencing, the platform announced that the fundraiser had fulfilled its stated pretrial purpose and officially closed the campaign. Not long afterward, a separate fundraiser known as the Karmelo Appellate Fund was launched to help finance the appeals process. The fundraising effort has become a major topic of debate because of what happened after sentencing. Anthony was sentenced to 35 years in prison after a jury found him guilty of fatally stabbing Austin Metcalf during a high school track meet in Frisco, Texas in April 2025. Following the verdict, court records showed that Anthony submitted paperwork seeking indigent status, indicating that he lacked the financial resources necessary to hire private appellate counsel and was therefore requesting court-appointed representation. That filing immediately sparked questions online. Many observers wondered how someone connected to a fundraising campaign that generated more than $630,000 could qualify for a court-appointed attorney. It's important to note that indigency determinations are based on a defendant's own financial resources and legal standards established by the court. The existence of prior fundraising efforts does not automatically determine whether someone qualifies for appointed counsel. Nevertheless, the filing fueled widespread public speculation regarding how the crowdfunding proceeds were spent and whether any portion of those funds remained available for legal representation. At the same time, online discussions increasingly focused on the defense strategy employed throughout the case. Critics questioned decisions made by Anthony's legal team and family, particularly regarding whether a plea agreement was ever offered, seriously considered, or rejected. A recurring narrative conversation has been the belief that Anthony may have received a significantly shorter sentence had the case been resolved through a plea agreement rather than proceeding to a jury trial. However, the details of any plea negotiations, if they occurred, have not been fully disclosed publicly. Those questions have led some commentators to speculate about the role Anthony's parents played in the decision-making process and whether going to trial ultimately served his long-term interests. Among the most vocal critics has been commentator Matt Walsh, who argued that the existence of the fundraising campaign created financial incentives that some believe should be scrutinized. Walsh publicly questioned whether the continued litigation helped sustain fundraising efforts and whether that dynamic influenced strategic decisions surrounding the case. Supporters of Anthony strongly reject those claims, arguing that there is no evidence showing that fundraising considerations played any role in legal strategy and that families facing serious criminal cases often rely on public donations to cover extraordinary expenses. Still, the controversy remains. Why a defendant associated with a fundraising effort exceeding $630,000 relied on publicly funded legal representation during portions of the case, and why court-appointed counsel remains involved in the appeal. Others argue that those questions can only be answered through a clearer accounting of how the funds were allocated and what expenses were actually paid over the course of the proceedings. Ultimately, the debate has evolved beyond the verdict itself. For many observers, the conversation now centers on transparency, legal strategy, and whether the decisions made throughout the case were truly in the best interests of a teenager facing the possibility of spending decades behind bars. Now that we've examined the financial questions and controversies that some believe may have influenced the trajectory of the KarmeloAnthony case, let's turn to another case that many people have compared to it, one that resulted in a dramatically different outcome. The case of Case Allison has resurfaced repeatedly in discussions surrounding KarmeloAnthony because both cases involve high school students, fatal stabbings, claims involving self-defense, and jury trials in Texas. As a result, many observers have questioned whether factors beyond the facts of the cases, including race, public perception, community sentiment, or prosecutorial decisions, may have played a role in the different outcomes. Like Anthony, Case Allison chose not to resolve his case through a plea agreement. Instead, Allison pleaded not guilty and exercised his constitutional right to a jury trial for the fatal stabbing of his Belton High School classmate, Joe Ramirez, in 2022. After hearing the evidence, the judge reached a verdict on April 29, 2025. Rather than convicting Allison of murder or manslaughter, the Bell County judge acquitted him of both of those charges and instead found him guilty of the lesser included offense of criminally negligent homicide. That distinction proved critical. A murder conviction carries significantly more severe penalties because it requires the jury to conclude that the defendant intentionally or knowingly caused another person's death. Criminally negligent homicide, on the other hand, reflects a finding that the defendant acted with criminal negligence but without the level of intent required for murder. The result was a substantially different sentencing outcome than what KarmeloAnthony ultimately received. For many people following both cases, that raises a difficult question. How did two Texas school stabbing cases that appear similar on the surface end with such different verdicts? Supporters of the comparison point to several similarities, including the ages of the defendants, the use of knives, allegations that the victims initiated physical contact, and claims that the defendants feared harm. Others argue that the differences between the cases are just as significant. They point to the prior history between Allison and Ramirez, the evidence of threats and discussions about fighting before the incident, the number of wounds inflicted, the differing witness testimony, the circumstances surrounding each confrontation, and the legal instructions given to each jury. The debate has also expanded into broader discussions about whether race, media coverage, public pressure, community attitudes, or access to resources can influence how criminal cases are perceived and ultimately decided. Nevertheless, the Allison verdict has become one of the most frequently cited comparisons in conversations about the Anthony case. And for many observers, it remains a focal point in the ongoing debate about fairness, consistency, and equal treatment within the criminal justice system. So let's break down what actually happened in the Allison case. The story begins on May 3rd, 2022. Case Allison was 18 years old and a senior at Belton High School in Texas. That Tuesday morning at approximately 9:47 a.m., Allison and one of his friends walked into a boys' restroom at the school. Minutes later, 17-year-old student Jose Joe Ramirez was fatally stabbed. To understand what led up to that moment, investigators look back several days earlier to a confrontation at a prom after party. According to testimony presented at trial, Joe Ramirez confronted Allison after believing he had acted aggressively toward a friend's prom date. The two teenagers exchanged words, and Allison later claimed that Ramirez pulled a gun on him during the dispute. These teenagers had guns. However, that claim became a major point of contention during the trial. One witness testified that while someone did display a firearm at the party, it was not Joe Ramirez who did so. After the altercation, tensions continued to build. A Snapchat group chat was created, and messages presented at trial showed discussions about the possibility of a fight. At one point, Allison suggested meeting at a local park. Ramirez reportedly declined, and discussions shifted toward fighting at school, although no specific time or location was ever finalized. What happened next became a major focus for prosecutors. Multiple witnesses testified that in the days leading up to May 3rd, Allison made threatening statements about Ramirez. According to testimony, text messages included requests such as, "Bro, bring me a gun." Another witness testified that Allison talked about wanting Ramirez hospitalized and discussed seriously harming him. Investigators also recovered a voice recording from Snapchat in which Allison allegedly stated that they were going to catch Ramirez the following day and send him to the hospital. By the morning of May 3rd, the conflict had been simmering for several days. After first period, Ramirez and four friends followed what witnesses described as their normal routine and headed to the boys' restroom. Shortly afterward, surveillance cameras captured Allison and another student entering the same restroom. According to testimony, the encounter was not prearranged, and Ramirez appeared surprised to see Allison there. Several students who witnessed the confrontation testified that Allison initially expressed reluctance to fight at school. Graduation was approaching, and witnesses said he stated that he did not want to jeopardize finishing school. In a recorded interview with investigators, Allison later said that as the confrontation escalated and students began removing backpacks, he pulled out a knife he had brought to school and warned, "Don't touch me or I'll stab you." At that moment, another student began recording the confrontation on a cell phone. The video reportedly captured Ramirez throwing a punch toward Allison. Almost immediately afterward, Allison lunged forward and stabbed Ramirez. A scream is heard and the recording abruptly ends. Following the stabbing, surveillance footage showed Allison running from the restroom and leaving school grounds. He eventually made his way home. Because numerous students witnessed the incident, investigators quickly identified Allison as the person involved. Within an hour, law enforcement officers arrived at his residence. According to testimony, officers found Allison in his bathroom while he was on the phone. Prosecutors later alleged that he was telling someone he had done something at school and was asking for help getting to Waco, Texas. From there, the case moved into the criminal justice system, eventually resulting in a conviction and sentence that many people now compare to the KarmeloAnthony case. However, as we'll discuss, the facts, evidence, witness testimony, and claims of self-defense in the two cases differ in several significant ways. Police eventually searched Allison's home and recovered the knife used in the attack. During interviews, Allison reportedly told investigators that he had stabbed Joe Ramirez only once. However, testimony from the medical examiner painted a different picture. According to the autopsy findings, Ramirez suffered 4 separate stab wounds. The most serious was a large wound to the chest that caused catastrophic injuries to both the heart and the left lung. The medical examiner also documented 2 wounds to the buttocks, along with injuries to the upper back and left forearm. Following the investigation, Allison was charged with murder. When the case went to trial, jurors were given several options. They could convict Allison of murder, manslaughter, or criminally negligent homicide. Ultimately, the jury chose criminally negligent homicide, the least severe of the 3 charges presented. In simple terms, criminally negligent homicide means a person causes someone's death through actions that were criminally careless, even if they did not specifically intend for the person to die. As a result of that conviction, Allison was sentenced to 10 years in prison. For the sake of full context, there was also testimony during the trial suggesting that Ramirez and some of his friends had reputations for getting into fights and at times ganging up on other students. That testimony became part of the defense's effort to explain why Allison may have feared a physical confrontation.
Bullshit! I need y'all to help me understand something. 2 young men in school, 2 stabbings, both claim self-defense, but 2 totally different outcomes in the same state. Kaysen gets into a fight with a Hispanic dude in the bathroom. Hispanic guy throws a punch. Kaysen stabs him several times and takes his life. Kaysen admitted to the stabbing, and the jury found him not guilty of murder. Instead, convicted of criminally negligent homicide, only convicted of 10 years. And they fighting to get that lowered right now, claiming that the sentence was unconstitutional. Now let's look at Karmelo. Karmelo claims self-defense after a fatal stabbing of another student. But in his case, the jury finds him not only guilty of murder, but sentences him to 35 years. Now, how do you explain 2 instances involving kids in school, 2 deaths, both situations having knives, but they both had 2 different outcomes? The only difference in this case is Kaysen is white and Karmelo's black. Had Karmelo been a white boy and the Metcalf brothers been black, totally different outcome. Yeah. Or had Kaysen been black, Kaysen be facing the same amount of time. Probably be doing life. But see, black people, we occupy space in these racist bigots' minds. And they only come out when this type of administration is in office. They don't never have this kind of confidence. Never. But, I wouldn't even say confidence, because these motherfuckers hide behind, like, fake profiles. They can't come talk to you on their actual profile and tell you how they really feel. Straight bitch made. But it's always been about race.
With that background established, let's look at why so many people compare the Allison case to the KarmeloAnthony case, and where the similarities begin to break down. The first major difference is the relationship between the people involved. Case Allison and Joe Ramirez knew each other. They attended the same school, had interacted before, and had a documented conflict that stretched over several days leading up to the stabbing. The evidence presented at trial showed an ongoing dispute, arguments after prom, discussions about fighting, and communications between the 2 groups before the incident occurred. KarmeloAnthony and Austin Metcalf, on the other hand, were essentially strangers. They attended different schools and, based on the information publicly available, had no known history with one another before the encounter at the track meet. The next major distinction involves planning and pre-existing conflict. In the Allison case, prosecutors introduced Snapchat messages, witness testimony, and recordings that suggested both sides were aware a confrontation could occur. Discussions about fighting had taken place in the days before the stabbing, and multiple witnesses testified about threats and hostile messages exchanged during that period. By contrast, in the Anthony case, there's currently no evidence of days of prior conflict, planning, threats, or arrangements to fight. Instead, the confrontation appears to have developed in real time during the track meet itself. That difference may seem small, but from a legal standpoint, it can significantly affect how a jury evaluates intent, foreseeability, and claims of self-defense. Another significant distinction between the 2 cases involves evidence of planning and intent before the confrontation. In the Allison case, prosecutors presented messages showing that Allison was the one who initially suggested a location where he and Joe Ramirez could fight. Witnesses also testified that Allison made statements to multiple people indicating that he intended to seriously injure Ramirez if the fight took place. In the Anthony case, no evidence has been presented showing that KarmeloAnthony planned a confrontation with Austin Metcalf or communicated an intention to fight him beforehand. Based on the evidence introduced at trial, the encounter appears to have developed spontaneously during the track meet rather than as part of an ongoing dispute. There is, however, one notable similarity. Both defendants brought knives onto school property on the day of the incident. The difference lies in what prosecutors argued happened before those knives were used. In Allison's case, evidence was introduced suggesting that he discussed violence and made statements indicating a willingness to use a weapon. In Anthony's case, no comparable evidence has been presented showing that he told anyone beforehand that he intended to use a knife against Austin. Another area where the cases overlap involves the warnings both defendants claim to have given before the stabbings occurred. According to Allison's recorded interview with detectives, he warned Ramirez by saying, "Don't touch me or I'll stab you." Similarly, multiple witnesses in the Anthony trial testified that Anthony made statements before the confrontation escalated, including, "Touch me and see what happens." While the wording differs, both statements have become important pieces of evidence because they are being used by the defense to support claims that the victims were warned before physical contact occurred. The next comparison involves the level of force used by the victims before the stabbings. In Allison's case, cell phone video reportedly showed Ramirez throwing a punch. During trial testimony, there were also claims that Allison suffered a head injury as a result of that punch. Additionally, some witnesses testified that Ramirez and his friends had locked the bathroom door, preventing Allison and his friend from leaving. However, that allegation was disputed and was never conclusively proven. In Anthony's case, witness accounts have been far less consistent regarding the physical contact that occurred before the stabbing. Some witnesses described Austin's actions as a push, others called it a shove, and some characterized it as a forceful two-handed push. One witness even compared the movement to a football lineman's block. What has remained relatively consistent is that witnesses did not describe Austin throwing a punch before the stabbing occurred. Despite those differences, supporters of both defendants often point to one common factor. In each case, there is evidence that the victim initiated the first physical contact before the knife was used. Whether that fact legally justifies the defendant's actions is ultimately a question for the jury. Finally, the two cases differ sharply in what happened immediately afterward. After the stabbing at Belton High School, Allison left campus, returned home, and was later found by police. According to testimony, officers encountered him while he was on the phone asking someone for transportation out of town. Anthony's actions were different. While he left the immediate area where the confrontation occurred, testimony indicates that he remained on school grounds. Witnesses stated that he was stopped by a coach and remained at the scene until law enforcement officers arrived and took him into custody. Those post-incident actions became another point of comparison between the two cases, as prosecutors and defense attorneys often argue that a defendant's conduct after a crime can shed light on their state of mind at the time of the incident. The last major difference comes down to the verdict itself. In both cases, jurors had the option to convict on either murder or manslaughter. But in Allison's case, they were also given a third option, criminally negligent homicide. Karmelo's attorney tried to get that same option added to his trial, but prosecutors pushed back hard. Their argument: there's simply no evidence in the record that Karmelo was unaware his actions could lead to someone's death. The judge agreed, and that lesser charge was taken off the table entirely. Now, here's something interesting about both of these cases, because they both happened in Texas. Each defendant got to choose who would sentence them, the judge or the jury. And that choice made a huge difference in outcome. Case Allison trusted the judge, who handed him the maximum sentence for criminally negligent homicide, 10 years. Karmelo went with the jury, and they came back with 35 years. So that's the full comparison. Two cases, a lot of similarities, but some pretty significant differences in how they played out legally. Before discussing race, sentencing, or fundraising, I think it's important to remember something that often gets lost in these conversations. At the center of both of these cases are young men who lost their lives. When a case becomes heavily politicized or racialized, people can become desensitized to the human tragedy involved. Regardless of race, background, or circumstance, no one deserves to be stabbed and killed. My condolences go to both the Metcalf family and the Ramirez family, who have suffered unimaginable losses. As for KarmeloAnthony's case, my personal view is that he was not treated entirely fairly by the justice system. Based on the facts that have been publicly presented, I struggle to see evidence of the kind of premeditation that is often associated with a murder conviction. When comparing his case to the Allison case, in my opinion, a manslaughter charge may have been more appropriate for a jury to consider. At the same time, I believe Karmelo was also failed by some of the adults around him. It appears that substantial funds were spent on a variety of expenses, while the one thing that mattered most, ensuring the strongest possible legal representation and strategic advice, may not have been prioritized. Ultimately, I believe two things can be true at the same time. Austin Metcalf's death was a terrible tragedy, and KarmeloAnthony may not have received the best possible guidance or representation available to him. I'd love to know what you think. Does this feel like a fair comparison to you? Do you believe that Karmelo received his sentence because of the color of his skin? Or maybe a private lawyer with more resources would have represented him better? Leave your comments down below. Let's remember we can disagree, but keep POVs respectful to one another. See you in the next video.